Good afternoon, everybody. You know, we're here to talk about Africa, and you sound like you've been dragged in kicking and screaming. Okay, that feels a whole lot better because you are in for such a treat. We have an amazing panel that is here with us, and it may not look like it is possible, but through this panel, we are literally spanning the world. We are starting with me, who is here grounded, holding us down, holding us at home here in East Africa. But then we are going to stretch our wings and talk about what does it mean to talk about the sea is history in two ways. One, let's just talk about Africa. Can we do that? Will you talk back to us? Because I will come back to you as well. And then let's talk Africa. You know us, Africa, let's talk. And because we are such a big, loving group, we are also going to have others in here with us. So I'm going to introduce the panelists who will be enabling us to have this amazing conversation. And I am really excited. I think all three of them, and the fourth voice that I will bring into the room, I think this is your first time in Kenya, not in East Africa, but in Kenya. So welcome, karibuni sana. And in order of the way we are sitting, let me start with introducing on my immediate left, and I'm trying to make sure I get everybody's details right, with Hamza. Hamza holds a master's in English literature and civilization. I thought that was that's a contradiction, but it's okay. But Hamza holds an MA in English literature and civilization. He's been working in education and international development for a while. And he currently serves as the country director with the British Council in Algeria, which explains something because his book, Sand Roses, appeared in English. And I was like, an Algerian writing in English? Like he had the concept of Macondo, speaking across to other people as well as, and I'm sure there are Algerians reading in English. I just thought, this is so fascinating, and we'll talk about that. For those of you who would like, let me just set up about this session. We won't talk about their books. Their books are available, and there will be sessions where you can meet them and listen to them talk about their books. So Hamza has got a session that is at 4:30, which is straight after this, I believe, and it will take place in Ukumbi Mdogo. And that particular session is going to be about siblings, conflict, and transformation. And you will find, so when I picked up Sand Roses, I thought it was going to be, the usual story, a sister or a brother who fall out about something, and then they fight, and then they get transformed, and they discover their family. But it's actually, that's not the story. So I encourage you, please go to that session if you can, because in the true spirit of Macondo, we want to make you feel like you can't do too many things at one time. There will be another session happening simultaneously right here with the speaker who is to my immediate left. And Shubhangi Swarup, who has written Latitudes of Longing. And I should say this about Sand Roses. Sand Roses was the runner-up for the Island Prize for the debut African novels. Talk about achievers, high achievers. You write for the first time and everybody is so excited about your book. It's winning prizes. Well, so did Shubhangi. Shubhangi wrote a book, Latitudes of Longing, that has been described by people who are really trying to figure out what is it, how do we describe this book, what is it that this book is doing. And I think one of the descriptions, I'm looking for it, that she writes the fiction of nature. And if you are wondering what that means, let me encourage you to join her. She will be right here at 4:30, and where they will be talking about this question of nature. Does nature have a voice? Should nature have a voice? Isn't it just something we just exploit and use for ourselves? And what does it mean when you begin to think about it in a special way? Shubhangi, the book that she will be talking about, won, I think, 2 prizes at least that I'm aware of. The Tata Literature Live First Book Award and the Shushila Devli Literature Award. So again, these are amazing, amazing writers. And I am extremely interested because Shubhangi and I had been having this conversation. I think she was like, let's talk Africa. You guys do know I'm not African. And we were like, yes, and that's why we want you. So from East Africa, we will be stretching north within the continent, and then across our shared seas, Ziwaku, Namchumbi, as we heard yesterday, what others out there call the Indian Ocean, to Goa and Mumbai, where you would normally find Shubhangi. And then on my immediate right, we have Jeferson Tenório, who has written The Dark Side of Skin. Jeferson comes to us from Brazil. He is a he's got multiple awards and multiple books. And I'm looking for your session, Jeferson. Okay, I think it's on the printed one. I had printed some things because I was going to also read from our other writer. And this book in particular won the Djibouti Prize. And Jeferson, you spoke just before this, right? Writing the Self? Yes. But this book is literally, it's about, and I think I'll give him a chance just to say a little bit because he won't have another chance. But this book is set in Brazil, and it really looks as the dark side of the skin. We are going to be talking about race. And those of you who attended this session last year would remember that Jamila Rabiero, who talks to us, spoke to us about how Brazil is often seen as this place where the racism is a non-event. Nobody talks about it. And one of the things that she talked to us about is why it matters that as we talk about Africa, we realize that Brazil is part of Africa and that we are connected in many ways and that we must be concerned about this. And so what I'm going to actually do is just to ask Jeferson if he could just say just a little bit about that book, because for those of you who won't have another chance to listen to him, it gives you a sense of what the book will be about.
Boa tarde a todos. Boa tarde. Bom, o meu livro, O Avestapele, trata da história de um professor de literatura que é brutalmente assassinado após uma abordagem policial.
Good afternoon, everyone. My book, The Dark Side of the Skin, talks about a literature teacher who is murdered by the police.
E quem vai contar a história desse personagem é o filho dele, o Pedro, que é um rapaz de 22 anos e que conversa com esse pai morto.
So this story is told by the son as a narrator, and during this book, the perspective is one of a son talking to his dead father.
E durante essa conversa, ele inventa a história do pai para conseguir lidar com o luto e com a ausência paterna.
And during this story, he creates or imagines this conversation with his father so that he can cope or deal with the sorrow of losing or the absence of his father.
And the session that came just before that, and thank you for that, was on writing the self. And I think what's so interesting for me is that for this son to find himself, he has to go back and find his father and look for his father, understand things about that to find himself. In a way, I wanted to also ask that because last year, what we did do in setting up the session was we talked a lot about the past and how part of us understanding and moving into the future would be about going back. But today, we will start from there, and we will go a little bit forward. And I will come back to you in a minute. But now I want to come to Shubhangi and to Hamza. And I'm going to ask you to do two things so we get a sense. First of all, tell us a little bit about your work. But then I had asked each one of you, if possible, to give me a sense of another writer, a book, a quote, something you've read that has sparked your thinking about Africa. So, Hamza, Shubhangi? Okay, whoever went first, Their country has just won the biggest prize, and India has lost because it handed it over to Algeria. It's all your fault, Shubhangi. He has a master's in civilization, so we'll let him go first.
There you go.
Hello.
But clearly no technical skills to turn this on. Thank you. Yes, a little bit about Sand Roses. Sand Roses is a historical novel set in 1930s in a small town called Bousada in Algeria, in the desert, in the Sahara Desert. And it tells the story of these two dancers who belong to a tribe that used to have a very unique culture. These were women who used to be raised from young age to sing and dance and entertain. And then at a certain age, they would go and work at cafes in the city. And then they would sort of collect their dowries and go back to their village and marry someone and raise the next generation of dancers. And this is when I first learned about this part of our history, I was both fascinated but also annoyed that nobody's been talking about this, that this isn't something we learn about at school or we talk about. And so Sand Roses talked about these two sisters who were raised to be dancers, and they go to Bousada to pursue their dreams. One of them wants to travel the world because there's, these dancers used to attract a lot of tourists, a lot of painters, photographers. Some of them would travel with circus, or go, at one point they went to Chicago to be part of the fair. The other one just wants to collect her dowry and go back and marry her fiance. And then they learned that the city known as the City of Joy for most tourists is actually a city of horrors for these dancers, because they, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of, there's the colonial army there, and it presents a lot of violent opportunities, really. And so the story begins when these two sisters kill a French soldier in self-defense, and then when they try to hide the crime, they find themselves drawn deeper and deeper into a big cycle of violence that sort of puts everybody in danger, but also gets them to question who they are and sort of how they belong to this kind of world.
Yeah, because I want them to come for your session. But I want to keep that thought that we're talking about an Africa where we have even sisters, people who grow up in the same context with different dreams. And that dream is interrupted by others who come to the space with their own dreams. And then this has repercussions for who we are when today we say we are Africans. Whether we talk about it from Algeria, whether we're on the continent or we're in diaspora. Great start. What was the quote? What was the person, what was the thought that you came into this conversation? Who else do you want to bring into the room?
Thank you for that. And I think, we've had this conversation, I've been thinking about it a lot. And like you said, you were surprised that Sand Roses was written in English. And I think, in Algeria in general, we're more sort of connected with Francophone Africa, with the Francophone world, with the Arab world, because of the languages we speak. But when I was studying, I was reading a lot about African literature, and so I think we read a lot from Nigeria, and so things fall apart come to mind because it's Chinua Achebe sort of sets this world of like Africa before and after colonial powers come into play. But also, I think one of my favorite books was Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi, because also she has these two sisters, actually twins, who are torn apart in a conflict in Nigeria, I think in the 70s. And I think that really, it helped me learn a lot about the history of Nigeria, but also in terms of how these cultural differences can sometimes create some of the conflict. And so I think when talking about sort of going back to our past, but also looking at their future, I think that was a very that was a moment that shaped the past, but also the future of Nigeria and part of Africa as well.
So the ways in which these stories move from not only space to space, but also through time, and how this question of conflict and what it means then shapes who we are today and who perhaps we will become.
Sorry, I cheated. I brought two people, but
yeah, that's fine. So now we have the Nigerians in the room. Can you ever leave the Nigerians out of the room? But here they are. They've come. Shubhangi, please don't bring Nigeria into the room, because if we have too many, they're going to overpower us.
I'll spare you. So I think I have a master's in ignoring civilization. That is what my first book is all about. I worked very hard at ignoring the Indian civilization. So the narrative thread of my novel, Latitudes of Longing, is a tectonic fault line. I hope you guys know what a fault line is now, because that will be a separate session in geology. It's a crack on the earth. It's where two continental plates or oceanic and land plate meet. And there's generally a lot of violence like earthquakes, mountains, valleys, this kind of, earthly drama that I call it, or geological drama. So I decided to use that as my plot, and I diligently followed it and all the stories told on the crack of the earth. And by doing that, I realized that I successfully avoided a lot of India. I started in the Andaman Islands, which is in the margins. Then I went to Myanmar. Then I went to Nepal. And then I ended in this kind of no man's land in the snow desert between India, China, Pakistan. Honestly, I don't know which other country is involved there because it's too high and too desolate for anyone to go. So, when I started approaching publishers, one publisher asked me, "You've gone to a great extreme to avoid India." And I was like, firstly, our idea of India is this mainland, urban metro, what do you call dystopia. So I didn't mean to do it. I was just working hard at ignoring these things. And I have a lot of insects, fossils, I have
Goats.
elements, goats, all kinds of ghosts in my novels. So it's a different sketch of characters in the novel. And now on to your second question. What was
Because I am going to then say, and we're talking about Africa. What does all of this have to do with Africa? We will find out.
I was trying to avoid this question in the email by telling you, I don't have anything, but I'm caught anyway off guard. So my sister is here in the audience, and I remember when I was in my young teens, she went to the US to study, and she got back this second-hand copy of Amos Tutuola, the palm white drinker. And
Another Nigerian?
Oh, I didn't even know that, to be honest. Because I just I consumed the book for the book. And
that's fine.
And it just blew my mind, the way he used language. It was irreverent, it was scary, but, it was fantastical. And after that, I started exploring these various kinds of realism that exist within African writing. My idea of magical realism was a slightly more sanitized version, but this kind of fear that comes, like even with, say, Ben Oak, Ryomi Akuto, it's, I appreciated this. I suspected it was an impact of maybe folk tales and oral stories and so many other influences. So, and honestly, that was quite formative. And a technical question, is Egypt also, or is that too north?
I don't know. Is Egypt part of Africa?
I don't know. I'm just thinking of Najib Mahfouz. I'm not thinking of the question.
That's a loaded question.
So I'm not thinking of the question, but I'm thinking of Najib Mahfouz. It was formative, the way he uses, these different kinds of realism. He wrote about Arabian Nights, which honestly has a lot. I mean, I feel the tale of Arabian Nights has a lot of inspiration and influence from East Africa. Like they say, Sinbad the sailor and his adventures, or those large birds come from Madagascar. And having gone to Zanzibar, I can sort of see where, that world comes alive. Yeah. But his particular rendition of the Najib Mahfouz's Arabian Nights and Days is a seminal text for me. It just takes what I thought was simple fantasy and magic to another transformative level.
You've just mentioned, and I had a note on this because I found that so interesting. When you were in Zanzibar, now that you've brought Zanzibar into the room, and therefore you've brought our sea, we take that sea very special into our room.
Okay.
You said this. When I first told people I'm going to Zanzibar, most mistook it for a seedy local bar in Mumbai.
Which is true.
Although it lies just across the sea, on the other side of the Indian Ocean, our fate tied together by the monsoon winds, Zanzibar remains an exotic land in our imagination, like Timbuktu or Machu Picchu. And I'm
That
thinking
is
about
true.
what you've said in terms of this whole idea of the magical realism and how this has been something that you found both with Tutuola and then later on. And I'm just thinking, talk to me a little bit about this. What was your experience in Zanzibar? Because I know when you went there, it was not, right?
Okay. See, this is just a tip for all the writers. Things may come back to haunt you that you have done and not entirely processed. And this is one of those articles.
I won't quote you, cite you again, I promise.
Yeah. So it's so interesting that I am married to a man who has relatives on every port in East Africa, including Dar es Salaam, and I still thought it was exotic enough to be the end of my world. So it's two very different realities, and they still are, right? Like my entire life I have gone really far and out there to experience exotic and adventure and what does it mean to be another, only to realize that I'm coming closer and closer home. The further I go out, the further I go inside and find home. And one of the experiences when I landed up in Zanzibar, we asked them to give us give us your best local food, which was biryani and kachumbar. And that's like, that's like, I mean, to anyone in India, that's us.
Is Zanzibar
It's
Africa
quite,
to you?
I can't tell you what Africa is. I can't tell you what the Indian Ocean is. And I can barely tell you what India is. So I feel like how we perceive the world reflects on how we perceive ourselves. And I am really struggling, and on some days I succeed, some days I fail, on what does it mean to be Indian? Am I part of the subcontinent, or am I limited by these political borders that are as old as my father? I'm not kidding. That's how old our political borders are. So should I identify with that, or should I identify with a whole subcontinent? And I was thinking, based on, of course, also my creative journey, to me, I feel like, where does my history begin? Does it begin with human history, or am I part of a larger life history? Am I part of the history of this planet? Where do I choose to find my beginning? I choose not to find it in civilization. I choose not to find it in geographical coordinates. I don't want to call it a continent or an ocean. To me, it's a coordinate. Because over time, even that continent has shifted. My continent was an island that broke off Madagascar, as I was telling some of the writers. I live on this rip of land that was connected to Madagascar. That's where we broke off from. And there's a lot of similar flora and fauna. And I feel a longing, to see how is it there, because I know how my forest looks now. So sometimes I feel, does my history begin with the Himalayas? The Himalayas came up when India banged into Asia. It caused the entire monsoon winds, which makes so many of our lives and migrations possible. So where do we choose to put the beginning and end to our history?
Do you see why this is? I always say this every time I'm in a panel like this. I love talking to writers. We began with fault lines and mountains, and now we're in the sea, and then we have the water pushing an entire, so what we think of Asia today, has that just messed with your mind? Because it's in Madagascar ours as Africans, right? Okay, let's keep the thoughts going. Last year, and it's so fascinating you took us there, Aminata Fona's last thought was on the need to go into deep time and the need to understand that. And she also has been going into what is the earth telling us that then speaks to us about who we are as Africans. So let's hold those thoughts as we now travel right across through the other sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and we end up in another continent that we are really connected to. So I'm going to ask you, who did you bring into the room? Which writers, not necessarily African, which writers have inspired or influenced your thinking about Africa?
Eu penso que o Oceano Atlântico, apesar das distâncias, criou um imaginário dos brasileiros em relação à África e dos africanos em relação aos brasileiros também.
I think that the Atlantic Ocean created this imagery that the Brazilians have of Africans and how Africans perceive the Brazilians.
E ainda bem que existem escritores africanos e brasileiros que acabam tornando o nosso imaginário um pouco melhor, né, da cultura, da outra cultura. Né?
And I'm really glad that there are African writers and there are Brazilian writers who help improve this image we have of each other, the Africans of the Brazilians and the Brazilians of the Africans.
E eu comecei lendo autores de língua portuguesa em África, como Macondo, Paulina Chiziane, Agualusa.
And I started by reading Portuguese authors in Africa, such as Macondo, Agualusa, and Chiziana.
Paulina Chiziane.
Paulina Chiziana.
De Moçambique.
Yes, the Mozambique, from Mozambique.
So Lusophone writers or Portuguese writers? So those are
Lusophone, they write in
writers.
Portuguese.
So African writers who are writing in Portuguese.
Eu gostaria de começar falando de a história de uma deusa ou de um orixá.
I would like to start this by telling a story of a goddess, or orisha as they call it in Brazil.
Se chama Iemanjá,
Their name is Iemanjá,
que vem do Yorubá, Ieye Omu Je, que significa mãe que é filho, mar. Não, os filhos são peixes, e Iemanjá seria a mãe desses peixes.
The name is Yoruba, and the children are fishes, and the manja is the mother to these fishes.
E a história dela é que ela se casa com um rei chamado Oreque,
And her story is that she marries a king named Orike,
e ele a trata muito mal e ela decide fugir desse casamento.
and he very heavily mistreats her, and she decides to run away from this marriage.
Então ela se transforma num rio a partir de uma poção que o pai dela, que é o oceano, dá para ela beber e se transformar num rio e fugir mais rápido.
So she transforms into a river through a potion that her father, the ocean, gives her that allows her to run away faster from this dysfunctional marriage.
Mas o rei Oruque, ele se transforma numa montanha.
But this king Orike, he transforms himself into a mountain.
Então Iemanjá pede ajuda para um dos filhos, que é Xangô,
Iemanjá then asks one of their children for help, who's Manjo,
que joga um raio no meio da montanha e abre um caminho para que ela chegue até o mar.
so that he may throw a lightning bolt at the mountain to open a path so that she can finally reach the sea.
Então ela se transforma na mãe do mar. Então todo aquele que entra no mar automaticamente se transforma em filhos de Iemanjá.
And that transforms her into the mother of the sea, and everyone who enters the sea turns themselves into the children of Iemanjá.
Mas não esqueçamos que o mar também é um lugar de acolhimento, mas também é um lugar de tragédias, de revoltas, de tempestades. Então não é qualquer mãe. Quando a gente entra no mar, precisamos pensar também nisso.
But let's not forget that the ocean is not only a pleasant entity, it's also a place of destruction, a place of revolution. So when we go to the sea, let's always keep that in mind when we think of our mother.
O mar, para os africanos e para a sua diáspora, é um lugar também de morte e de identidade e de unificação ao mesmo tempo.
The sea to the Africans and the diaspora is a place of death, but also of unification.
E há também todo um projeto de colonização quando há uma ideia de fixação de uma única identidade.
There is also a project of colonization when there is a fixation on this very single individuality or personality.
Portanto, o mar nos ensina a ser fluidos, a ter mais identidades, a ter múltiplas identidades.
So the sea teaches us to be fluid, to have many identities, all of them different.
E foi isso que eu aprendi com os autores africanos.
And this is what I learned with the African authors.
Wow, you see me. Thank you so much for that. You see me shuffling pages because I was thinking there are two ways this can go. And I think, well, one, the power of, we're back to the sea. We're back. We've moved from the sea on the, the warm sea that we know as Ziwaku, and then we're reminded that there's another sea. But both of these seas have got interesting depths and layers to it. I really like that image of everybody, this goddess giving everybody the opportunity, the possibility of becoming her children. But as you said, there's a second, this side has got the two sides to the coin. I was going to do this a little bit later, but I want to actually do it right now because I think it brings the other voice into the room. And we were supposed to be joined by Joao Melo, who unfortunately was taken sick. And what we did this morning was to read from, those ones are fine because I won't go to them, I think. I won't have time. But we read from this story. He actually sent us a big story that we read this morning, half an hour, thank you. And this story was supposed to be in conversation with the theme. What I want to do is just read 2 paragraphs of it and then tell you a little bit about that story because he picks up exactly where Jeferson has stopped. And then I'll come to all of you and ask you where your thoughts are. The story is called The Day Charles Bosangwa Arrived in America. And he said, with his apologies, if we could read a little bit of the story, it would be his voice into the room. I'll tell you how the story ends, but I think it's really important to start by hearing how it begins. The world had not yet lost its way when the Marabouts told Charles Bosangwa that he would arrive in America, of course by way of New York City, and that it would be raining the day he landed at JFK Airport. He lived in an obscure slum in a remote African city, unworthy perhaps of any literary attention, in the midst of other equally indigent beings, unemployed, beset by malaria and other arcane diseases that stubbornly resisted domestication, sexually out of control, hounded daily in the streets, alleyways, and squares by millions of religious messages, ecumenical, delirious, and aggressive, salvatory in intent, that pierced his body and shredded his fragile brain, packed with empty, dangerous, and perhaps pre-revolutionary thoughts. All those messengers, nameless messengers, coexist in a heterodox but imperious relationship with dirty, squalid dogs, shameless, cynical rats, agitated pigs, hens, and even young goats, like a veritable community that, in an extraordinary display of peaceful coexistence that others should emulate, share the cramped and labyrinthine space available, the plentiful puddles of dark water infused with mud and other deleterious, some of it enigmatic, and the foul smell that completely permeated a universe enclosed upon itself from which nothing emerged or ever would emerge to the rest of the planet. Thus, everything seemed to be in its place, a perfect balance that makes things work. One day, however, Charles Bosangwa woke up with a headache. But it wasn't a normal headache, one of those that manifested themselves since before he was born, for he had inherited it in the placenta of his mother, and it would accompany him all his life, up to the inevitable episode called death, which would be transmitted in like fashion to his descendants, and to the descendants of their descendants, and to the descendants of their descendants, and to the descendants of their descendants. Such headaches he took in stride. If they extended through his forehead and were more or less diffuse, accompanied by generalized and uncharacteristic body pain, the most probable cause was malaria. If they were concentrated in the middle of the forehead, and in some cases spread to the nasal sinus, the cheeks, and often the eyes, It was merely a symptom of a cold, however bothersome. Finally, those especially intense and irritating pains localized at the crown of his head, behind his ears, or at the base of the neck could only have one treacherous and insidious cause: hypertension. The headache with which Charles Bosanga woke up on the day when he made the unforeseeable decision that, for reasons of which I am at present unaware, would come to jolt in an unusual and profound way the great American nation, unless there is some surprise before the end of this account, was completely unlike the atavistic headaches that had always plagued him before. In truth, it was so strange that he himself did not know how to characterize and define it, much less identify its cause. I will not, therefore, presume to relate it. Artistic license, or if you wish, irresponsibility, has its limits. What matters is that morning, Charles Bosangwa decided to emigrate to the United States. Actually, the United States was already inside him for a long time. I want to pause there. What the story then goes to do is to talk about the many ways the United States had entered him, the many ways in which the United States then began to embody this space that you could become a global citizen. And the whole story is about his dream to leave his nameless village, to cross the continent, to go to Libya and attempt the crossing across the sea to Lampedusa in Italy so that he could achieve this dream. So I want you to sit with that for a while. I don't know if I'll tell you the end of it or not and what happened when he got to the other side. But my question to all of you, as you listen to this reading, as we think about the magical realism, as we think about the whole question of conflict, the whole question of what it does to us. We've traveled from the conflict in the colonial era, the conflict, the civil war that Chimamanda writes about, and now we're talking about the everyday conflict, where many of us Africans are like, but really, is this what life is supposed to be about? And where our dreams take us across the ocean, which we have been told by Jefferson is double-sided, across the Atlantic to America, where we can become global citizens and everything can fall into place. Let's talk Africa. Tell me about the future. What is your response to this? I'm thinking about what all of you have said.
And can I, and I'll try to see if this answers your question, but I think just building on that sort of the sea is double-sided and sort of like is a way for us to be global citizens. And then reflecting on sort of our own history in Algeria, where we have a different sea. It's not the ocean, it's the Mediterranean. But also our lives and our history have always been connected with the sea. And I was just talking to someone in the audience earlier today about how exactly that point of double-sided, where there's this whole fascination with the vastness of the sea, but also there is a motivation to conquer the sea, that specific term, to conquer the sea. And so there was a time where there was a lot of corsairs from Algiers who would go around the Mediterranean, and there was a point where they even got all the way to Ireland. They were bringing in slaves. There was a lot of trade, and so Algiers at one point was a very diverse sort of city to be in. But that also brought us a lot of colonialism. There was the Romans, and then the Ottomans at one point, and the French more recently. And so in a way, it's a double-edged sort of sword where it opens you to the world, but also brings the world to you, and not always in a good way. And then I'll bring in one other element. I think we've talked about the sea, we've talked about the ocean, we've talked about the mountains, and I think in Algeria we also have the desert, which is this sort of, which is also very similar to the sea because it's this, vastness, and it also gives people the same fascination of what's the potential, what's behind the desert, and then also motivation to conquer the desert. And at one point, it used to be also a way for us to connect with the rest of the continent. There was a lot of connections with Mauritania, with Mali, and then further down in the continent. But then there was a period, especially I think the last maybe 30 years or so, where those two elements, the sea and the desert, became sort of an isolation, sort of like a way for us to isolate from the rest of the world, because we're going through the civil war, and then I think we contracted into ourselves, and now the world doesn't know much about us. All of this is rambling to go to your question about the future, and I think the future now is really, I think we go back to looking into our origins and so looking beyond the colonial history. And so in Algeria now we're talking about actually reconnecting with the rest of the continent. Just in the next month there will be Canex, which is the big creative industry event that's going to be hosted in Algeria. And I think that's a really good way for us to be connecting in an artistic way with the rest of the continent. There is now also they're building a trans-Saharan highway which takes us across the desert to the rest of the continent, through Mali and other countries all the way to Nigeria. But still, it's a way for us to be, reconnecting, and I think that's a way for us to, to really explore our identity beyond, beyond what the colonial sort of history has brought to us, and finding ourselves, the depth of ourselves, in order for us to be moving forward, and that could make us very much a global citizen, or like a global sort of community, just because of our rich history that has come in different ways from the sea and from the desert. Does that answer your question?
And, it's not so much answering. I think it's a wonderful way. You're helping me think about how the sea both demarcates a space within, but also creates these connections. And going back to your thought, Shubhangi, about not allowing someone to box us off and say, this is all you are. This is the civilization you can own. This is where you belong. But saying, actually, no, because I can find other ways of belonging. I'm thinking about the Algerian War of Independence, and how that, at that point, was so inspirational to so much of not just Africa, but if you think of places like the Bandung Conference and so on, these connections were being felt way beyond the borders, and the sea was really an amazing way of connecting. And I think you're bringing those thoughts to us.
Yeah, and I think the 1960s, Algeria was known as the third world capital, or the capital of freedom fighters, and like I said, it was hosting freedom fighters from South Africa, from the US, from Latin America, for people sort of to connect around the notion of freedom. That has disappeared at one point where we're busy with our own internal problems. But I think that's one model, that's one way that any country sort of could be serving in that respect.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding us. So the other sea that's in the room now is the Mediterranean, which both, now we've come from Angola and then connected to what you're saying. And I want to come to now, I'd love to know Shubhangi, I'd love to know Jeferson. We are now going back to your thoughts and being in conversation, because where you've brought us, Hamza, is that past must make us reach towards the future. And we're talking about, let's talk Africa, but talk about us as part of this big global space. And what does it mean that in this story, Africa is like at the end, and saying, actually, no, how do we move back into the space where we're global citizens too? And this is what we have to offer. Shubhangi, there's an expression that's coming to your eyes somewhere along that I'm just fascinated about. So I don't want to put you on the spot, whichever of you two wants to go, but I'm intrigued by that.
Creio que podemos pensar o que significa ser cidadão do mundo.
I think we can ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a global citizen?
Para mim, ainda é uma grande utopia pensar em alguém que possa ser de fato cidadão do mundo, apesar de todas as barreiras e distâncias que nós temos hoje.
To me, it's still somewhat of a utopia to think of someone as a global citizen, even with all the barriers and also our borders that we have currently.
Creio que o sistema capitalismo não quer cidadão do mundo, mas consumidor do mundo.
I believe that the capitalist system does not want a global citizen, but it wants a global consumer.
Uma tentativa de unificar jeito único de viver, jeito único de se vestir, jeito único de comer.
It's an attempt to to make us all have a single way of dress, a single way of eating.
E quando nós miramos ou olhamos demais para o mar, nós nos esquecemos que temos que olhar também para a terra.
And when we look for too long at the sea, we forget that we must also look back at the land.
E olhar para a terra significa olhar para nós mesmos e entender que não podemos olhar para o outro apenas como a diferença.
And to look at ourselves, it means that we must look at others not only through the lens of what's different.
Devemos olhar para o outro como alguém que é único e singular no mundo.
We must look at another person as if they were individual, as if they were unique in the world.
E a partir desse momento é que eu acredito que vamos conseguir ser um cidadão do mundo.
And I believe it's just from this point that we will finally be able to be a global citizen.
I'm coming to Shubhangi, but that is so amazing. I will just read a few more lines from Joa, which actually just picks up on that thought. Exactly where I stopped, where I said the United States was already inside him for a long time. It entered him through his eyes and ears by way of multiple simplified and explicit messages that randomly and uncontrollably, the thought, circulated in the networks that cross and unify the weakened planetary flesh, contaminating it beyond repair. Fiber optics, satellites, transoceanic cables, radio, television, internet, emails, Viber, WhatsApp, Instagram, whatever. Phrases, sentences, images, labels, anathemas, truths, lies, half-truths, half-lies, post-truths, post-lies. The great world system, disseminating through the centers that command Hollywood, through the innocent and benign veins of YouTube, Netflix, and others that are being secretly designed at this precise moment. Simple entertainment, obviously, about which I am not complaining. Shubhangi.
This got me thinking in so many ways. Firstly, when we speak about this citizenship, I come from a coast, and that means when you're standing on a coast, you can either look at land, which is most of my city, They use the beach as a backdrop to their lives on Juhu Beach and many of our beaches in Bombay, literally taking photographs of sunsets. Or you can look at the sea and, put your back on the land. And I tend to look at the sea as a place of belonging. And there's a very childlike question I want to ask. When we are 5 and 6 years old, we also consider the sharks and the whales and the crabs citizens like us, right? And then we grow up and education tells us that citizenship is just us. It's our politics.
As human beings.
As human beings. But now that I'm with my children, and even when I was a child, even a bee is, your country is a garden, and the bee and the earthworm and the millipede are all your fellow parliamentarians, right? That is your politics. That's everything. So I fear using the sea as a backdrop or a metaphor, but not as a literal heaving ecosystem that we all owe our origins to. And how do I respect and use that as part of my identity to, the ships that sailed. Now we have migrations of it, them, whales, and so many animals get killed in the migration. Or we have islands of plastic. That's us also contributing, right? Vortexes and plastic entire, I think there is a continent bigger than Australia of the junk that we have disposed. Can I think of all that also? That's what I'm thinking. And, related to the important point you made about global consumer versus global citizen, it's such an important, warning. And I wonder, how can we have an opinion globally, Right now we are even denied that. My experience of publishing a book in 17 different languages brought it to my attention that when you come from the South, you tend to write from experience and not from research. This is an assumption. There is always this identity politics at play. So how do I break out of that? I try to, also enforce that, some places in India as foreign to me as they could be to anyone. I'm also focusing on research. I mean, how do I influence this international stream of ideas? Because I feel this Western project has taken our civilization down a particular path. And there is something very revolutionary in a festival like this, which is we can actually, take a step back and think, do we dream of another way forward? And, what is that way? For me, that is what has brought me here. What is that other way of doing things and influencing?
So I want to just pick up your question. I think it's such a great question. If we were to dream, right? And I know, Jefferson, you said it's so difficult. It feels like utopia because we are often so bogged down with the realities of what we face in our everyday. We are bogged down by just the knowledge of this is the world is, and this is what Joao explores. The world is set up in such a way that I, as an individual, or we in this room, or whoever, we're too few, we're too weak, there's nothing we can do. So the only thing we can do is become part of them. When you become part of them, then your voice counts and the voice matters. But let's just assume that this is Macondo, right? Yes. Guys, we are Macondo citizens.
Yes.
We are Macondo. Anything can happen. Anything is possible. What we decide here and now is going to happen. So you are going to lead me in saying, if there is one thing, your dream, this is what I want to see happen. And when we talk Africa to the world, Africa amongst ourselves, Africa in that big sense where we are connected through the seas, and I love that fault line, to each other, we are the center of the world. We can actually make the world be what we want it to be. What would that dream be? What is the one project of your heart, the one project of your vision that moves us from saying that's utopia to saying, if all of us here in this room committed ourselves, folks, we can change the world. So I'm giving you willing people. See, they said yes. They're citizens of Macondo. They can make it happen.
Something comes, I'm not going to overthink it. What comes to my mind is if each of us could have a belief that I am the center of the world, and write with that belief, explore the world, or whatever job I take, my exploration, carry that grounding that I am the center of the world. It's not the Greenwich Meridian that decides how many hours away I am, It's just a fluorescent green line on a small island, Just if I can think and believe that, I feel it would be revolutionary.
Let's just say it together, people. I'm saying it. You people don't seem to believe it. Let's say it like we believe it. You're talking to yourself. Self, talk to self. I. Don't wait for me. I'm saying it. I'm talking to myself. I'm talking to Mshai. 1, 2, 3, go. Mshai, I am the center of the world. Say it like you believe it.
I am the center of the world.
Let's take that thought. You have an opportunity to push back to her and tell her, hey, Shubhangi, that one is, I don't buy it.
Eu só ia dizer que eu tenho sobrinho que, se a gente disser isso para ele, eu acho que não vai ser muito bom. Sobrinho de 4 anos de idade.
I have a nephew who's 4 years old, whom I believe if we told that to him, it wouldn't be a very good idea.
Yeah, unfortunately, we know yours is 4-year-old. We have people in Kenya who will remain nameless, who believe that about themselves, and it hasn't been good for us. But I'm coming to your project, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Hamza?
My dream is for Macondo to colonize the world. Sorry, just half kidding.
I was going to say colonization. Ouch.
No, but really I think it's for Africa to, I think 3 main things that really come to mind. I think one, for Africa to embrace its identity, to recognize the diversity within the continent, but then also to connect as a continent, and I think that's very important.
So I like this. We're starting first with ourselves, each one of us as an individual. And then we are saying it won't just be this individual. That individual will connect, will recognize that we don't all have to be the same. And then we will, what was the third one? I was trying to take the notes.
And then to connect. So
connect.
Once we've identified, or we've embraced our identity, we've sort of recognized the diversity, then we can sort of connect.
Hamza, let me push you back on that. We've been doing that for a century and more. In fact, we've been doing that for centuries. And we are still here. Give me, how does this look like for you?
I think it's true, probably, I think a lot of people have been through this for a century. And I think maybe sort of in Algeria, we're a little bit late to the party. I think right now, what's going on in our context is we are really trying hard to move away from the colonial narrative. And I think that's the first step of identifying sort of ourselves. And because, our identity is not just the colonial history, there's so much more. So now you can see, for example, people going back to what was going on in the 1500s. I always cite an example of a movie that came out last year. It was a big success. It's called The Last Queen. And it was probably one of the first historical sort of movies that didn't talk about the colonial history. It was about 1500, this last queen and then nobody was speaking French. It was a completely different architecture, completely different all of the characters are like from the 1500s. And so that was the first time people were, recognizing a different part of their history. So in a way, we are a little bit late to that party. But also, I think, to be honest, I think an event like Macondo today is a perfect example of how we're connecting without sort of going through the West. So, we're connecting intercontinental. And I see a lot of events like that are bringing, I think, people from all over the continent. And I think that is a step that probably wasn't the case maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So I think, yes, it has started, but we're finally getting to the connection. And it's, now we are learning about each other. We're learning more about Nigeria, but, our neighbors in India and in Brazil, but also, again, bringing some other parts of the continent that haven't always been so part of it.
The Nigerians have paid. I promise you, they have insisted on being on this panel. What you're saying that is so important for me is that sense of saying, in this moment, if we are the center of the world, there can be many centers. One of my favorite teachers, Carl Boyce Davis, talks about moving beyond unicentricity and saying there can be many centers, but we are the center of the world, and we figure out the world from ourselves, and we make our connections and engagements without worrying about what other people are thinking. And we'll go out to them, but we start where we are. Jefferson?
I have a dream.
Tenho sonho. Oh. Sorry.
Eu disse essa frase porque, enfim, é uma frase bastante conhecida de Martin Luther King.
I've made this statement because it's a very well-known statement made by Martin Luther King.
E também me lembra um livro de um escritor angolano, do José Eduardo Agualusa, O Vendedor de Passados.
It also reminds me of an author, an Angolan author named José Agualusa. The name of the book was The Salesman of the Past.
E ao final do livro ele cita essa frase do Martin Luther King e depois ele atualiza essa frase dizendo que nós precisamos fazer um sonho.
So at the end of the book, he quotes this phrase or sentence, and he cites that we must actualize this phrase. We must make it into a reality, no longer just a dream.
Eu gosto desse verbo fazer ligado ao sonho porque dá mais materialidade e mais lucidez para realizar um sonho.
I really like this verb to do in association of dreaming because it allows us to bring materialization and actualization
E acho que
of the dream.
fazer um sonho significa, antes de tudo, olhar para nós mesmos, identificarmos as nossas falhas, os nossos erros, aquilo que há de mais sombrio em nós mesmos, para que a gente possa fazer o contrário com os outros.
And making these dreams means looking at ourselves, looking at our darkest sides, our faults, our mistakes, everything that's wrong with us. And from that, we learn to do better and to make this dream into a reality.
E foi por isso que eu escrevi um livro chamado O Avesso da Pele.
And that's why I wrote a book named The Dark Side of the Skin.
Porque é desse modo que nós podemos criar um mundo onde nós não precisamos, num evento, falar sobre gênero, sobre raça e sobre o capitalismo.
Because this is how we can create a world in which we don't need to come to an event and talk about gender and talk about race and talk about capitalism.
Essa seria a minha Macondo.
This would be mine, Macondo.
You know, it's so interesting. Last year, Yvonne, I think it was, who talked about world making as a big project. And we've come full circle. It starts with saying, I'm the center of the world, but then being really honest about what that means, and then engaging with others, knowing they're bringing their truth, they're bringing their skills, they're bringing their baggage. We'll work it out together, but not being afraid. And I really like that we're starting with the individual, because when you think about getting the government to do things, it just feels impossible, but we're starting with ourselves. And because we're starting with ourselves, I'm now going to come to you, right? You may have a question. You may have something about one of those dreams. We're talking Africa. We're talking as Africans. We're talking as people in Africa. We're talking as people who are part of global Africa, but we're moving towards that end. Back to we started late, so I'm taking a couple of seconds. Can I have some questions? Comments? Are we just sitting with it? Okay, I see one. Do we need more than one mic? Okay. I feel like the mic is going the sea route around. Oh, it's coming.
Thanks as well. Thanks for the panelists. My question is, as we start talking about Africa, should we think about the prize? Well, writing as an African writer and the prizing, when we're talking about those winning of the awards, where do we start as writers?
Okay.
From the African perspective?
So as we talk, do prizes matter? Should prizes matter? For those of you who are writers, great question. And I did start by saying that there are many prize winners here.
Hi, my name is Laura. Thank you so much for tickling my brain in the right spaces. I just wanted to ask about decoloniality. Hamza, you had mentioned a little bit about moving away from colonial narratives. How or what language can we use to decenter this partition of Africa and our colonization history as this marker of two times, two spaces, or two worlds, right? Yeah, that's my question.
So the question on decoloniality, and then I see actually one hand there, then we'll come across and we'll start there. So just let's finish since we're on this side.
So before you became writers, I think all of you had like people who inspired you guys. Can you please tell us more of the people who inspired you and became authors?
Okay. And I'll ask them to come to that question if they can, because those are questions that will also be answered in the other sessions. But if we have time, I'll also ask you to take that one. So let's move it to this side now. We're thinking Africa. We're thinking about what we need to do. I'm so happy to know that next year, by the time we come back to Macondo, we'd have done most of the groundwork and we'll be moving on to the next level. This is the power of Macondo.
My name is Theophilos, and I'd like to share a story. A few years ago, I was going through immigration check at JKI, And the immigration officer looked at my passport, and he looked at me and he said, Nigerian. And I was almost going to say, no, Chinese. So the point is, when you have a country with a population of over 200 million people, I mean, it's not possible to escape them, you know. But and on a more serious note, I find myself in spaces where people judge me or see me through the lens of my nationality and not for the person I am, you know. So I have to start proving, oh, I'm Nigerian, but, you know. So please, I'd like to encourage everyone here, when you meet a Nigerian, just give him or her the chance to be human.
There had to be one in the room.
And you have a lovely dress, by the way.
Thank
Thank you.
And I want to just pick that up because I think that connects that with that question of diversity and individuality. There's a reason I kept saying the Nigerian thing. Keep coming to the mic as I'm talking while you get to the next person. Kenyans, did you hear that nobody is inspired by us? There's a reason I kept pushing that thing. Me, I didn't hear anyone saying, a Kenyan writer, so Kenyan writers need to inspire the world. Go ahead.
Hello. My question is for Jefferson. I know you're also in academia, and I'm wondering, because I have read that African histories have become mandatory in Brazilian education. I'm wondering if you, as a person in academia, you still believe that there are faults at hand while disseminating these histories and in sort of creating those connections.
Okay, and I've asked if you, when you're speaking, please stand up, but we're now looking at this question of correcting faults. And I wouldn't just say the academic, I think you talked about research as well. So as you work and you're writing and you're telling your stories, is there that, if I get it and understand well, is there that, do we correct what has been out there? Mike is with, I think it was there, yes, I was thinking there's one more hand. And then we'll come round and then we'll see if we have another set. You see why the sea, when you talk about the sea's history, the landmass in between has to be connected somehow by bodies.
Good afternoon. My name is Collins Buzu. I'm a Kenyan writer.
Please stand up.
Okay. My name is Collins Buzu. I'm a Kenyan writer. So I believe as writers, we actually write about relevance and we're actually an inspiration and actually are supposed to be answering questions. So with Africans, so what has been lacking for so long is that we, like the previous writers, they used to answer questions about colonialism and its effects. But have they, would we say, the modern day writers been able to answer questions about psychological needs in as much as the current people are facing problems, say addiction, and various other problems? So do the current writers answer such questions?
Okay, so as a writer, you're asking if writers are answering questions, which I find is completely interesting.
And answering questions in a manner that they are solving a problem.
Okay.
Yes.
So for those of us who believe writers are there to solve problems, do we think the writers are answering and solving problems? I saw your expression. I'll take those last two and then we'll come to all of you for whichever question.
Thank you. My name is Jackson Nyonje. Two questions. The first one is Africa has been dreaming for a long time, you know, Senko, you know, we have had Senko's dream, Nyerere's dream, Mandela's dream, Becky's dream. Have these dreams realized anything? Should we continue dreaming, you know, as Africans, or, you know, we stop dreaming? Or they're just mere pipe, actually, dreams? Secondly, we have been grappling with this problem of the phones, you know. We've been demarcated along the phones, Angulo, Lusophone, you know, Francophones, which has been a problem. So, eaten into our identity. So we feel, you know, very happy maybe say, we Anglophone speaking or we Francophone speaking. But then currently, now we have other identities coming up. That is along the economic blocks, ECOWAS, East African community. Do we believe they are going to solve the African problem? And you know that, what I've mentioned, what is the place of the writer?
Okay. So we are back to this question, the issues that are there to deal with. What is the role of the writer? I want to keep taking it back, that we're not just talking about writers, we're talking about ourselves. Okay, that last question, and then we'll come to the panel, and then if we have time, we'll take more.
Hi, my name is Adiambo. So my question is more about the appropriation. Like, for example, I recently attended a launch of it was a comic book written by comics from all over Africa. But you realize that the book, first of all, it is only written in English in Germany. Then the exhibition has been done in Nairobi, then some in Germany, and others in the UK. So you realize that and coincidentally, the comic was focused on Pan-Africanism. So is the focus on the selling the book and making sales like for African writers, or is it about for impacting people in the African nation? Because it is us Africans who are supposed to learn more about what Pan-Africanism is, in my opinion. I think we should focus more on exhibitions in around African countries rather than exporting our art to the Western world. Yes, thank you.
So she's taking us back, and it comes back to the panel. What is our role? Who are we writing for? Who are we working for? How do we come together? How do we go through the boundaries? These are a lot of the questions that are coming through. How do we move from where we are to solving problems? Where do we start? What do we do about decoloniality? It's not sitting in the National Theatre and thinking back to the decolonizing the mind 50, 60 years ago, all that comes back to our minds. So I'm coming to the panel. Whichever of these questions works for you, and if you can, quickly the influence, who has influenced you? And I'm going to tweak that question. Who has influenced your thinking and helping you think about the issues we're putting on the table as you hear back from the audience?
I'll try to talk a little bit about the colonialism, because I think that was addressed to me, and a little bit, I think, in relation to correcting the histories. And to me, I think what's really important, I always say, and I feel like I'm hypocritic, I am a bit of a hypocrite about it, but I always say the best way to move away from colonialism is just stop talking about it, but I keep talking about it. So it's, I need to do better about that. But really, I think what's important is to dig into our stories, because I think at the end of the day we are humans, and I think we're here all about about books, and I really believe in the power of story, because then you can tell the stories of people and communities, and I think that's one way sort of to give voice to a lot of I go back to diversity. I think Africa has a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of diverse histories, and I think it's important to give voice to all of those people. And it goes back to, I think, the correcting history point, Mshai, I think, because when I was doing research for Sand Roses, again, like I said, I was really fascinated, but also annoyed that it's a story that's not being told enough, or almost always buried under sort of shame and conservative beliefs. And I found two trends that sort of tell the story of the Red Nile dancers. One of them is very orientalist, very almost fetishist in a way that sort of like portrays these women as a sort of exotic creatures. And then there is the other side, mostly sort of the Algerian side, who either deny the existence of that history, or they would try to justify it. They say, oh, it was poverty, it was colonial times, they didn't have another choice. And I was really making a conscious effort to, I don't want to say give them a voice, because it's not even my place to give them a voice, or reclaim the history, because it's not mine to reclaim. But maybe in a way I was trying to sort of tell that story and sort of explore their voices in a way, because that's, I was really trying to make sure that I tell a story from the point of view of women who did live through that experience, and what would it feel like in that regard. And to me, that's one way sort of we're exploring our history, we're moving away from colonialism, and I don't know if it's correcting the history, but sort of like exploring other facets of it in a way.
Thank you, I like that. And it's the personal projects where we started, where you say, this is important to me. I think you're agreeing with the thought that was put out there, that these are projects we need to take on, but not wait for the big, somebody from out there to do it. It's the personal projects, whether you're, especially for writers. Do I have teachers in the room? Okay, we've got Kazi Kwetu. We've got a lot of work that we as teachers can also do. Shubhangi or Jefferson?
Many questions.
São muitas questões.
Estou fazendo de propósito.
He's doing it on purpose.
Se conseguirmos responder a todas essas questões, creio que vamos conseguir criar Macondo hoje mesmo.
If we could answer all those questions, I believe we will be able to create Macondo today.
Portanto, o que eu vou dizer aqui será para criar mais perguntas do que respostas.
So what I will say now is to create more questions than answers.
Vou citar uma intelectual nigeriana chamada Yoronke Oyewumi. Me desculpem a pronúncia.
I will quote a Nigerian writer. Her name is Yoronke.
Yoronke Oyewumi.
Yoronke Oyewumi.
Desculpe minha pronúncia.
I apologize for the pronunciation.
Foi uma intelectual que eu estudei durante o meu doutoramento no Brasil.
She was an intellectual whom I studied during my PhD in Brazil.
E ela tem um livro chamado A Invenção das Mulheres, onde ela fala sobre questões de gênero, o feminismo negro, identidade.
And she has a book, como se chama?
A Invenção das Mulheres.
The Invention of Women, that touches on gender, on black femininity, and
identidade.
Identity.
E num dos capítulos ela diz que a principal forma que o Ocidente tem de apreender o conhecimento é pela visão.
And in one of the chapters, she claims that one of the ways that the West has of imprisoning us is to muddle our vision.
E isso tem a ver com a questão da imigração.
This is related to the matter of immigration.
Porque se o único modo de compreender a realidade é pela visão, é muito importante para para essa forma de conhecimento, definir muito bem quem é branco, quem é negro, quem é homem e quem é mulher.
It is very important, if we are to retain this vision, to separate and identify individually who's white, who's black, who's a man, who's a woman.
Porque a visão identifica, classifica e depois oprime.
Because this vision identifies, classifies, and then oppresses.
A forma que nós temos de fugir desse modo de apreensão do conhecimento é valorizar os outros sentidos, como a escuta, por exemplo, que é muito mais filosófica.
And one of the ways we can use to escape this knowledge imprisonment is to put more value onto our other senses, such as our hearing.
So I'm thinking with you, Ngugi wa Thiong'o has an essay where he does say that the artist's role is to ask questions. It is not to answer them. And so I concur with you that these questions are not just being put into the room for the panel to answer, but I think they're amazing questions. And thank you to everyone who's asked a question, because you're helping us to think about some of these things for ourselves. And thank you also for that citation from Yoronke Oyewumi and her project. What I'm really liking about this is we're beginning to ask are we thinking with each other? Are we reading each other? Are we learning from each other? So back to your conversation of coming in and understanding the diversity and then picking it up and then learning from each other and creating projects together. I really like the fact that this is being reinforced in so many different ways. Thank you for that.
Sorry, to add one thing. You know, I'm acutely aware of, when we speak of colonization, that I am also a modern day colonizer in especially my part of the planet. My government has also taken over islands where, you know, we are responsible for perpetuating the same cycle of colonization. There's a question I would like all of us to ask. Sometimes some people don't want to be with us, but we force them to be with us. You know, I don't want to say who. In my context, it's very obvious. And at those times, am I thinking like a colonizer? That is a large question politically. But even at a personal level, I'm a colonizer when my demand for Wi-Fi and air conditioning leads a forest to go, because there is a particular way of life that goes with it and not mine. I am literally plundering for my way of life. So I am also a modern day colonizer in a different context. And do I have the honesty and humility to acknowledge that and work with that?
Shubhangi can always be relied upon to start us, like, I feel like we could start a whole new conversation, because we've talked a lot as if we are the ones who are fighting that oppressive power. And now she's turning it around and saying, what if that oppressive power is us? And what if, yes, it's me, it's, you know, each of us, but also that it isn't only about the human world. And I think, personally for me, even reading your book, I kept going back to that I go through life and it's human beings that matter. And you kept reminding me that we're just a small part of what this is all about. And what does that mean? I feel like we could start a new conversation, but we really have to come to an end. I was going to say, I'm going to come to each one of you for one last sentence. And the reason being, I'm aware that some of you are going into other sessions immediately. Otherwise, I would take the minutes that I know we started a bit late, but I also want to be fair on you because I know you're going into sessions in a few minutes.
Not to say much, but just it was amazing that we ended on that note that, you know, I am a small and important part of the universe, which was a far cry from where we started. I am the center of the world.
I am the center of the world. I may be small, but I'm the center. And I can bring change. I'm going to come to, now we've started a new pattern, right? Now we're going this way. If any of you has a last sentence or last thought in Portuguese or in English, let's see what you want to do this time.
Vou voltar para o Brasil com essa frase de ser o centro do mundo e com a ideia de que o centro pode ser em todos os lugares, menos um lugar de opressão. Obrigado.
I will go back to Brazil with this idea that anyone can be the center of the world and that there are many centers of the world except in a place where there is oppression. Thank you very much.
I would like to say that a true center of the world acknowledges that it takes a whole world to sustain a tiny dot.
I love the way you're weaving in and out of each. So this gathering, this talking to each other, it is important to talk to each other and recognize that not everybody is me, and then figure out from there what happens. Not every living being is me. I am not, even if I'm the center of the world, I am not the priority of the world. And as you were speaking, I have to end with just one last stanza from a poem. But before I do that, please join me, first of all, in giving a big vote of thanks to our amazing sign language interpreter. We've talked about languages, and I cannot tell you how thrilled I am that we have languages that are not only being heard through the ears, but we've also moved to another space of transcending boundaries. So thank you to you and your colleagues for making that possible. Let me also thank the amazing technical team that keeps us running, so that you can hear us, you can see us, we can be on this stage. I also just want to remind you that these books are outside. You can get them in the bookshop. Our amazing panelists are around. If you can't get to their session or you want to talk to them a little bit more, they will be somewhere in the space. Jeferson Tenório has written The Dark Side of the Skin. Hamza Koudri has written Sand Roses. Joao Melo has written Angola is wherever I plant my field. And trust me, his stories are just amazing. They're short stories, and you will thoroughly enjoy them. And Latitudes of Longing has been written by Shubhangi. Please give them a round of applause. I also want to remind you that panelists from here will feature in both the session across in Ukumbi Mdogo and the one here. I will not judge you for which one you go to because I don't know where I will be. I'll probably end up somewhere in between and trying to go back and forth. And that this evening, when the sessions are ended, please, after 5:30, there is a performance right here in this theater of a film, Vuta Nkvute, and that we do continue tomorrow. I want to end with these last lines, and it's just the end of a poem by Christine Craig, which is called The Chain. And it kept coming to my mind as you were speaking. The beginning of the poem talks about, and I won't go to that beginning, but it starts by saying, it's somebody who says, I must speak now. Things are pressing on my mind, and I must break free. And as you spoke, these last lines resonated in my mind. This is Christine Craig from Jamaica. And you must know this now. I am a free Black woman. My grandmothers and their mothers knew this and kept their silence to compost up their strength, kept it hidden, and played the game of deference and agreement and pliant will. It must be known now how that silent legacy nourished and infused such a line, such a close-linked chain to hold us until we could speak, until we could speak out loud enough to hear ourselves, loud enough to hear ourselves and believe our own words. Thank you.